What are 10 of the most important lessons I've learned in 10 years living overseas? That's going to be the topic of today's video. Now, it's incredible to think that I've been living overseas now for about 10 years. I started living overseas from July 2011, so that's almost 10 years ago now. Now, what have I learned during this time? Now, I've learned too many things to put it on one video, but I've condensed it down to just 10 things. Now, number one is listen to my gut feeling. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm not saying my gut reactions and my gut instincts are always right. Sometimes they are wrong. But in general, my gut reaction has been pretty right. And whenever I haven't listened properly to my gut reaction, I've often regretted it later on. In comparison, when I've gone with my gut reaction, I've seldom regretted it later on. And I think one of the reasons for that is A, usually my gut is right, but two, even if it's wrong, I can always pivot. So unless it's a very important thing that you can't go back on, let's face it, for example, let's say today if I make a decision and it's wrong, and I base it on my gut reaction, in a week's time, I could probably just change that decision or alter it or pivot a little bit. So unless it's such an important decision whereby I can't go back on it, listening to my gut is usually right. And I'll give you an example of when I haven't listened to this particular reaction. Now, when I was at school, also university, I was always seen as somebody who didn't necessarily listen to the crowd. I wasn't afraid to kind of challenge university lectures and so on. But when I went into the financial services area, to start with, when I got a new job, I kind of followed what everybody else did. I thought, well, these people have more experience than me, they know more than me. Now, that was the case at the time, but what I didn't realize at the time, which I realize now, is that when I went overseas, it was an incredible period of change for the world. Because if you think about it, 2011, 2012, 2013, what were the two trends going on? Now, number one, yes, the financial crisis was like 3 years old from 2008, but people were more interested in doing things differently. So a lot of those disruptive companies like TransferWise, Revolut and so on, they were getting bigger. People wanted something different. They didn't want the same old corporate brands. Number two, though, more significantly, we're going into a digital age. Now, if you think about it, with the internet, it started in about 1995, but hardly any of us used the internet in the 1990s, at least extensively. I can remember the first time I used a computer and the internet, I think it was in about 98 or 99, and very few people shopped online during that period. By about 2005, more people were using the internet, but it tended to be things like eBay and those kind of firms. So it wasn't huge, but by 2010 and 2011, we're starting to see the signs that even high trust services were going online, but it was relatively early on in that process. So things like, tax, accounting, financial services, legal services, buying property, hiring people, freelancer websites, all those kind of things. It was starting to get bigger, but it was still a minority of cases. So when I went into financial services, a lot of my bosses or managers at the time would say things like, oh, business is best done face-to-face, or things like that, or business should be done in that way, or you shouldn't email people because they might just take the information and use it for their own purposes, or loads of other things. That might have been true in the 80s and the 90s, the 2000s, even up to about 2009, 10, 11 or so. But the period when I was going into financial services, my gut told me that things were changing fundamentally, that we were moving to an online world. People wanted things to be easy, and more on that later. But I didn't listen to my gut as much as I should have. I only went to a fully online model about 2018. Now, a lot of people said, oh, you did well to kind of do it before COVID. But obviously, if I would have listened to my gut, I would have done it even sooner. Let's say 2015, 2016, or even sooner than that. So listening to my gut has been the right decision for me. And it's especially been the right decision when I've done things that are controversial or breaking industry norms. So what I've said many times before is if you do things that are normal, it's not always a good thing because everyone else is doing it. If you think about it, let's think about something like social media to start with. Now, Almost every company now uses, for example, Facebook ads or Google ads. Not every single company, but you know what I mean, most companies. So it's not controversial to use those techniques, right? But that means that because everyone's doing it, it's more competitive, more people are using it. Whereas say in 2010, 11, 12, most people thought, oh, you can't do things like financial services online. So it was controversial to do things in that way. But that brings me back to one of the things I've learned. Almost all of the most profitable decisions I've made, or the best decisions I've made, are things that go completely against the crowd. So for example, one of the best people, if not the best person I've ever hired for my business, I got him from a freelancer website, and hardly any of my competitors, even to this day, use freelancer websites for that specific function. They might use it for other functions, but his particular job function. Likewise, even though now many people, because of the pandemic, are doing things remotely, when I started doing things remotely, people thought it was almost scandalous. I can remember when I went to a convention and I told people I didn't do business face to face. You would think I was saying something like Hitler is right or something. They thought it was, wow, what an unacceptable almost model. Yeah, seriously, some people actually thought this is just not right. I mean, in a high trust service, you should meet people face to face. Now, obviously, nobody's saying that anymore, but that's the point, right? You should always be ahead of the curve, not behind the curve. So when I listen to my gut, I tend to be ahead of the curve, not behind the curve. So when I came into financial services, I made the huge mistake of listening to people who were more experienced than me, even if my gut was telling me the opposite. And I've seen this when it comes to my friends, associates, clients, people I know, almost anyone who's inside the top 1% or 2% in their industry does one thing consistently. They break industry norms. Yes, they work hard, they work smart. Many of them are smart themselves, and so on and so forth. But let's face it, everyone can work hard. You could be competing against someone who's like Margaret Thatcher and only needs 4 hours of sleep a day or something like that. Many people can also work smart. But if you work hard, smart, and in addition to that, you're creative, you break industry norms, you do things differently, that's more likely to open up the door to opportunity than just working hard. I'm not saying working hard is a bad thing, but in isolation, it's not enough sometimes. Now, number two, I spent 4.5 years in China, and I learned two important qualities in China. Number one, Chinese pragmatism and business savvy. Now, one thing I would say about China is this: it's not the easiest place to live in the world. There are much better places in Asia to live. However, as an expat, you will learn quite a lot in China about how to do business, because the Chinese mindset, I'm not talking about every Chinese person, obviously, I'm talking about the more entrepreneurial Chinese people who live in places like Shenzhen, also Shanghai and so on. They're very fast-paced. They adapt to the times. They do things quickly. So for example, when I was first in China, most people were using cash, like just coins and notes. Only richer people usually had debit and credit cards. Yes, they had these Union Pay kind of cards, but very few people had credit cards which were linked to Chinese Visa or Master. Now, almost everyone, even old people, they're using their phones for just paying for things. They react to the times, they adapt much better than even countries that are much more developed like Japan and so on. So I did learn that they're quite pragmatic. I mean, the former Chinese leader, Deng Xiaoping, said it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. And one thing I did learn about a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs, they're very pragmatic in the way they think. So for example, a British person in financial services might say, oh, that product isn't what I want to do. You know, I don't like property, so I'm not going to offer property to my clients. But the Chinese mentality in general, I'm generalizing obviously, is, well, if I don't want it, that's irrelevant. If they think it's good for them, why can't I offer it? Right? That's just one example of many, but they're very pragmatic in the way they think. And that taught me a very important lesson, because there's a lot of things online like very idealistic business advice, but the pragmatism I saw in China actually helped me quite a lot. With that being said, I did learn in China that for all the faults about the West and the UK and democracy, it is the best system for governing people. But when it comes to business, I do think it's quite an entrepreneurial society. It's the equivalent of spending some time maybe in Silicon Valley from a Western point of view. If you live in America, regardless of whether you like it or not, you're probably going to learn something from the experience. And I found I learned a lot from my Chinese experience, both in good and bad ways. Now, number 3, as I've said many times before, don't speculate in the stock market. And what I've also learned is those people who speculate once will speculate again, and they often won't realize their mistake. So the same people who didn't want to invest in 2016 because, oh, Trump could get elected, blah, 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 are the same people who didn't want to invest in the 2020 election because of the so-called disputed US election. And on both periods, they got it absolutely wrong. And both times they were shocked. They were like, wow, Trump won, but markets went up. Oh, wow, now 2020, markets have gone up despite a disputed US election. And guess what? I fully expect them to speculate again in 2024. The same thing with COVID. They're amazed that markets have gone up despite a pandemic, but probably in the next pandemic they'll think the same thing. And they will be amazed if the same thing happens again. Ultimately, none of us can time markets. Markets can go up or down during recessions, depressions, pandemics, wars. So it's better not to second time market. Just get in, stay invested, have good asset allocation, and so on. Number 4. Most people don't prepare for black swan events. Now, what do I mean by black swan? So the author Nazim Taleb wrote a great book about black swan events where he talks about how so-called tail risks, unexpected risks, can basically derail an economy, an individual, a family, and so on. So a black swan event is a highly unlikely event, but if it happens, it's catastrophic. Now, I've seen so many successful business owners in Thailand in 2014 go from earning a lot of money to earning close to zero money because of the military coup. Same thing with Egyptian entrepreneurs after 2011. Many lost it all. Same thing in Venezuela. Same thing with COVID. A lot of people who had very successful like theatre businesses, restaurant businesses, bar businesses, they reached out to me during COVID and said, Adam, I now realize this was a huge mistake. I put all my eggs in my company's basket. Now I want to diversify. But the time to diversify is when you're doing well. And I think it's the same with business. If you've got a business which can be made into an online business and therefore a more global business, that's always going to be less risky than focusing on just one country. And the same thing with assets. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, like one stock, one bond, obviously. It sounds obvious, but I think people feel reassured by a core business because it's something they understand. And especially people don't prepare for black swan events if they've had like 10 or 20 or 30 years of success. So if someone's had 1 or 2 years of business success, they haven't completely relaxed. But if they've had 20 years or 30 years, they assume, well, I've seen many things, so I'm always going to be able to make money. But that's not always the case, as COVID has shown and previous events have shown as well. And I think especially in the West, people are quite complacent about this. In parts of the world where there's been a lot of political instability, which is most countries, let's face it, people are less complacent because they've seen what's happened in the past. Now, number 5, I would say income and wealth are not connected always. Now, it sounds obvious, and I always kind of knew this, but I think living in the kind of expat world and knowing many expats has really reinforced this for me. I know so many people who have super high incomes, but they don't have much wealth. Some of them have zero wealth or even negative wealth because they just spend more than what comes in on credit cards and whatever. I know people who have got, for example, I know one teacher who has actually got about 2 or 3 million US dollars because all he has done has been reinvest inheritance, invest small amounts every month for decades. He also got 1 or 2 redundancies, and yet he's got a lot of money. And I know a few people like that. Conversely, I know some people who are 55, 60, they've had executive salaries, but they're broke. So income and wealth aren't always linked. They are linked if people make the right decisions. Obviously, if you've got someone who's frugal and they earn more, well, of course your wealth's going to go up, but income and wealth aren't always related. Number 6, and this kind of links back to number 1 in a way, but don't care too much about what people think. So the aforementioned point about income and wealth aren't always linked. I think one of the fundamental reasons they're not is people often show off to other people. There's an expression, I think it came from Fight Club or something, that people spend money they don't have to impress people they don't like, to buy things they don't need, or something like that. I can't remember the exact quote, and it's very true. A lot of people, they overspend because they care about what other people think. They don't break industry norms because they care about what other people think. They don't even go on YouTube because they care what other people think. And it's a really bad mistake, because actually deep down most people don't care anyway. And also, here is another key point. What I've found is, and I think it was Margaret Thatcher or someone else who says, if you're in the middle of the road, you'll get run over from both sides, so it's very dangerous. And if you're just true to yourself, as per the first point, yes, more people will dislike you, but more people will like you as well. So for example, let's say you're watching a YouTube channel and you've got somebody who's, I don't know, I'm just giving something random here, like a big Trump supporter, and they're, I don't know, a fitness guru, and they wear a Trump hat when they're doing the fitness. Yeah, some people instantly hate that person, but that's irrelevant. You don't have to be all things to all people. The same if he was wearing a Biden hat. And I think it's a mistake to care too much about what people think, because that leads to you trying to put round pegs in square holes. So for example, even on this video, right, if something isn't perfect, let's say my dog starts barking in the middle of the video, I don't think I would edit it out. I would just think, well, if you're not happy with that, then that's your problem, right? So don't try to be all things to all people. Number 7, which is linked to number 1, the business landscape has changed fundamentally. Now, if you would have said to people 10 years ago, people would actually be more reassured by somebody who's wearing informal business attire. Or, for example, most people wouldn't actually want to meet people face to face. They want to do things online. People wouldn't believe you. But we're living in a completely different world now, which kind of leads me to another point, which is the path of least resistance is absolutely key. What do I mean by that? One of the reasons I think we've gone in the direction that we have in terms of more people wanting to do things online, remote, and so on, is it's always been human nature to want to do things more easily, the path of least resistance. So one of the reasons Amazon is so big or Apple's so big is you can just buy things online with a click of the button. I was having a conversation this week with one of the big 4 accounting firms. I'm not going to mention who it was, and I almost pulled out because they were saying, oh, we want this process, we want that process. I just said to them, look, if you're not going to make this easy for me, I'm just going to pull out. And that's the point. We're in an era where people want things to be done easily and simply. That's always been the case. People have always wanted to do things more easily, but because previously business norms were different, people would expect these kind of processes and even accept it. So for example, 20 or 30 years ago, somebody would have said, oh, just come round to our office so we can have a face-to-face business discussion. People might have just felt, well, that's the way things are done. Now people are less likely to accept that. And if you can reduce friction, that's key. So for example, if you're in any industry, if you can make it easier for your clients to deal with you, you're more likely to get more traction. You could have the best product in the world, but if it's hard to actually sell, less people are going to buy. You could have a subpar product and make it incredibly easy for people to buy it, and people will buy it. Of course, you want both things to be perfect, a great product and easy to buy, but the path of least resistance is absolutely key. It always has been key, but in the digital world it's becoming more and more important. Also, the penultimate point, number 9, is that people will laugh at you, but then they'll say they believe in you, or they did believe in you from day one. So for example, it's amazing how many messages I get from people who will say, oh, you did so well going online before COVID, I always believed in you, whatever. But those were some of the same people who would say things like, oh, this is ridiculous what this guy is doing, or whatever. And I've seen it time and time again with other people. You see it in sport, you see it in politics or whatever. People always say to people, oh, I believed in you from day one, but often that isn't the case. And the final point is that fortune does favor the brave in most circumstances. Taking calculated risks is absolutely key. That doesn't mean taking silly risks, but if you take more risks more often, overall, it's better, because with most risks, you're not facing what could be called a catastrophic situation, a black swan event. You should absolutely be worried about black swan events because they can wipe you out. But basically, you should take as many risks as you can, but make sure you're here tomorrow to tell the story. So when it comes to a small number of risks, you should be incredibly careful, more careful than most people are. Most people are not careful about black swan risks because they think, oh, it's unlikely to happen. They worry about losing 10% of their wealth, even though it's catastrophic, but they don't worry about losing 100% of their wealth. For example, if there's a catastrophic event, like their business goes bankrupt because of a lockdown, because they think, oh, it's not a high chance. But unless it's a really catastrophic risk you're facing, at the end of the day, you can always pivot. I've lost so much money on so many things, but that is not a problem, because overall, by making quick, decisive decisions, pivoting when I've made a wrong decision, overall, the net results have been far better than being ultra conservative. Almost everyone I know who has almost never lost money in business overall actually hasn't done that well. So taking calculated risks is really important. How can I help you? In two ways. First of all, are you an expat, a high net wealth individual, or just somebody who lives in a part of the world where it's difficult to get access to quality investment solutions? In which case, go onto my website on adamfayed.com and find out more. If you don't fit into any of those categories, then in which case there's a range of free material on my website, on this YouTube channel, and indeed on my Quora, where I get over 200 or have received over 231 million views in the last few years. And finally, if you want to actually read my thoughts in more detail, go onto Amazon and find my book on there.